because of the coronavirus. Millions have died, nearly 600,000 here in America. The social and economic cost is incalculable. The question is, was it avoidable? Right from the start on this show, we stood almost alone against the blanket lockdown strategy. Instead, we advocated for protecting the vulnerable, those most at risk. We warned that the cure could be worse than the disease. Well, Stanford University's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who you may remember was on our show last year, summed it all up perfectly in an article last week. Quote, "Governments and scientists rejected basic focused protection measures for the elderly. There is more than 1,000-fold difference in the risk of death between the old and the young. The failure to exploit this fact about the virus led to the biggest public health fiasco in history." Exactly, the biggest public health fiasco in history. When are we going to see some accountability for this? It is not hindsight to say the lockdowns were a cruel, counterproductive disaster. Fauci, the CDC, the public health experts, they had the data about this specific disease right from the beginning, just like we all did. Yet still, they pushed an old playbook for a different disease. In any other field, if you screwed up in as gigantic a way as Fauci has, and with such catastrophic consequences, you'd be facing an investigation at the very least. Instead, there's nothing. No attempt to find out why they got it so wrong. No attempt to learn lessons for next time. Speaking of which, for all we know, our taxpayer dollars are right now in some lab in China or somewhere else funding yet more of the risky gain-of-function virus research that was the most likely origin of this pandemic. The research that Fauci commissioned at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Former CDC Director Robert Redfield thinks that's where it came from. Media outlets from the Washington Post to the Wall Street Journal have given weight to that argument. Even CNN's Dr. Sanjay Gupta came around to the same conclusion. We've laid out the evidence week after week, and Fauci, his boss Francis Collins, and the NIH refused to engage. The only official investigation into the pandemic's origins is the utterly discredited WHO probe. This is not good enough. Ludicrously, Pelosi and the Democrats are demanding a 9/11-style investigation into the Capitol riot. But they're so deep in the cult of Fauci that they're not demanding one over a pandemic that was millions of times more deadly. All the investigative weight America can muster should now be applied to finding out how this pandemic started and why our public health bureaucracy made so many mistakes in its response. Joining me now, member of the House Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis, New York Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis. Great to see you, Congresswoman. First of all, tell us, what is this committee that you're on? What is it supposed to be doing?
Well, interestingly enough, as you mentioned, it's the Democrats that not only create these committees, but they're the ones who actually decide what our hearings will be about. And so this is a special subcommittee in which Representative Clyburn is the chair and Scalise is the ranking member. And, we've only had one hearing or two hearings so far. One has been on the economy and the other has been just very generic. But really, they haven't asked the right questions in terms of what we can be doing as members of Congress to try to get to the bottom of the origins of this. And as a matter of fact, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, we've actually questioned President Biden rejoining WHO. And as you know, we are the #1 funder of the WHO. And we really should be demanding accountability before re-entering. And that is something that we brought up in the Foreign Affairs Committee as well. But it seems like our president is doing whatever President Trump did. He wants to do the opposite, and he doesn't want to actually get any concessions or renegotiate to get either a better deal, if it's something like the Paris Accord, or in this case, demand answers and a thorough investigation.
Yes, exactly right. Well, you're right. You have to, because of the Democrats having the majority, you've got to go along with their kind of political maneuvering here. If the Republicans take back control in the midterms, is it possible then to use committees like this one that you're on or others to actually have a proper investigation into those two things I mentioned, the origins of the pandemic and the role potentially of Fauci's research, but also the response, these lockdowns? We need to question whether that was the right strategy.
You're absolutely correct. And we actually had Dr. Fauci at one of our recent hearings. And we brought up the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party, the double standards that have been used. You know, the fact that my local restaurants in New York City can only operate at 50%. Meanwhile, you go at the southern border and you have facilities that were meant for 250 people that have 4,000 individuals in it. You know, the fact that if you were an American citizen coming from South America, you would have to take a COVID test when you board the plane, but yet we have illegal migrants crossing illegally where they have no COVID testing. Some even display symptoms, and they're put in these facilities. And then, of course, we talked about the president's failure committing that he wanted to reopen our schools fully within the first 100 days of his administration. And now we see this week that date has come and gone, and yet 50% of our schools are still not functioning properly in in-person learning. So I think there's a lot going on here that we would like answers to. Unfortunately, we are in the minority, but we use that opportunity to show that there is a double standard. The fact that, you know, my kids in my district can't have athletics. You know, we can't have 12 kids playing ice hockey in New York City because of some just rule, arbitrary restriction that Mayor de Blasio has in place, yet everywhere else in the country you can play.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, at least you're there making these points. That's something. Let's hope that, you know, like that you can reverse the tables, get some answers. I mean, we've got so many interesting questions. Like, is anyone going to actually look at the fact that we had all these different approaches around the country? That's the beauty of America, the decentralized approach, federalism. You had Florida, totally different approach to the lockdowns you saw in New York and California with better results. Are we going to learn something from that? I hope that you'll be there to lead the charge, and you can come back and talk about it soon. Great to see you tonight. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, coming up, the verdict is in.